5, 6, 7, 8.
Hello, EXers. Welcome to the EX Podcast, episode number 16. This is your host, Stefan Vincent. I've started this podcast because I believe that companies have to think of themselves as employment brands if they hope to attract and retain talents. The podcast brings a different lens to the employee experience, a brand and customer experience perspective rather than a traditional HR perspective. Our guests, all thought leaders and disruptors in the EX space in their own way, come to this show to debate, discuss, and share best practices on the key components that foster employee engagement and strengthen company culture, and also to spark the conversation on how to create positive employee experiences. Now, let's be real. Employee disengagement is a big issue. Only 30% of employees worldwide feel engaged at work, and 20% declare they just don't give a crap about their work. The other 50% are in the twilight zone of engagement, not fully engaged, not completely switched off either. There's not much companies can do with the 20% paycheck suckers who just show up at work because they have to in order to collect their dues. Instead, companies should focus on the 50% of employees semi-engaged. That's where those companies can make a difference and impact their bottom line. Here, our guests share with you how we can make it happen together. Today's guest is Jacob Morgan, a 3 times best-selling author, keynote speaker, and futurist who delivers 40-plus keynotes a year to conferences and organizations around the world. He's also a contributing writer at Inc. magazine. Some of Jacob's clients include Cisco, Microsoft, Sodexo, and MasterCard. He's also the host of the Future of Work podcast. Jacob recently published his last book, The Employee Experience Advantage. Today we'll talk about why the employee experience has become a critical topic in today's economy. What are the drivers of the EX movement? Jacob's perspective on the gig economy and the future of work, and how technology will change the work we know today. This episode is brought to you by Fusion Alliance. Fusion Alliance delivers holistic solutions fusing together data, digital, and technology to redefine customer experiences and move your ideas to execution. That's why businesses across multiple industries have relied on Fusion's expertise and partnership for over 25 years. For more information, visit fusionalliance.com. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you get a chance, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes. You can open the iTunes app and type in Stefan Vincent or EX Podcast and you will find us there. And last thing, if you want to send me feedback, suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummit.com or on Twitter at @EX_summit. All right, let's get to it. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the EX Podcast. Very, very excited for today's guest, Jacob Morgan. Jacob is a 3-time best-selling author, keynote speaker, and futurist who delivers about 40-plus keynotes a year to conferences and organizations around the world. He's also a contributing writer at Inc. magazine. Some of Jacob's clients include Cisco, Microsoft, Sodexo, and MasterCard. He's also the host of the Future of Work podcast, which I listened to on a regular basis. Jacob recently published his last book, The Employee Experience Advantage. Jacob, it's an honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
For those who don't know you, tell us a bit more about your work and how you became a futurist. I'm quite intrigued.
Sure. So I am really interested in how the world of work is changing. I'm somebody that used to be in the corporate world, and around 8 or 10 years ago, I left that corporate world to go off on my own. And all of the full-time jobs I've had working for other people were always unpleasant. either because I'm just not a good employee or because, the situations I was in were just not good. And so I've always been really fascinated with and interested in this concept of how is the world of work changing? How do we build organizations where people genuinely want to show up to work? What does technology look like? Physical space, culture, all these wonderful things that we keep hearing about. Mm-hmm. And so for the past decade or so, that's what I've done. I explore these things and share the things that I learn. And I have my own podcast, as you mentioned. I keynote around 40 to 50 conferences a year. I do some advisory work for organizations, and in general, just create a lot of content on the future of work. So that's kind of what I do and where I spend my time. The futurist angle, so I received my certification in foresight from the University of Houston. I actually went back to school and received my foresight certification there. And, to me, the role of a futurist is somebody who helps organizations not be surprised by what the future might bring. So I never take the stance of trying to predict the future or of trying to tell people what one thing will happen. Instead, I give people options. And I say, based on what I see, based on the tools and resources and the frameworks that I have at my disposal, there are a couple potential scenarios that might occur in the future. Here's scenario A and what that looks like. Here's scenario B, C, or D. And you can plan for these 4 different options, right? So you don't predict one option. You kind of explore what many different options might be. And I think that's what a really good futurist does, because nobody has this power to predict anything.
Yeah.
Right. So, I all I can do is help you not be surprised by what the future might bring.
On the previous episode, I actually interviewed Rex Miller. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's also a futurist, and he wrote a book called Change Your Space, Change Your Culture.
What was his name again?
Rex Miller.
Rex Miller.
Yeah.
I'll have to look him up.
Anyhow, he said that in order to predict the future and even to study what the future might be, you have to study and know the past. Is it your take as well on this? Do you look at the past in order to predict what the future might be?
I think you certainly need to be aware of the past. But it's hard to look towards the past as a way to predict the future, right? It's sort of, if anybody has ever worked with a financial advisor, one of the first things that they always tell you is past performance is not an indicator of future success, right? That's kind of their disclaimer. They always say, look how great our funds did over the past 5 years. But by the way, past performance is not a good indicator of future success. And I take the very same approach towards futurism, towards exploring the future. I think it's very important to understand the past and how we got to where we are and trends and what we've learned from the past. But at the same time, I think it's a little bit of a stretch to extrapolate the past and assume that that is the direction that we will go to in the future. And that's because things change, right? So if you were to look at the rate of pretty much anything, for example, right? Look at the rate of smartphone adoption, look at the rate of just technological change. If you were to look back over the past 50 years, you would see that the general adoption and the general rate of change for things it was fast, but it was something that was predictable, right? It wasn't exponential, the way the rate of change is now. And so I think that it's really good to be aware of the past, but when it comes to the future, I think that's when the challenges arise, right? So you have to be a little bit creative there. You have to use various tools and frameworks that futurists get trained on. So it's kind of a tough thing, right? But that's in general my position. I think it's important to understand the past, to be aware of the past. But when it comes to the future, we have to remember past performance is not a good indicator of future success.
Right. when it comes to designing experiences, whether it's customer or employee experiences, probably the foundation of it is the empathy with the employees or the customers. And you studied psychology in college, correct?
Yes, I studied economics and psychology.
Is it what prompted you to get into that space and area of the employee experience, the future of work?
No. What prompted me to what prompted me to get into this space is having bad jobs working for other people. So originally my thought was that I would go to college, I would go work for a company, I would go get my MBA, and I was really interested in marketing. So I thought that I would go become, the CMO of like a Coca-Cola or something like that. And I became very disenfranchised after I started working for a few of these companies and realized that I'm hating my life. I'm not enjoying any of the work that I'm doing. And so after those points, I realized that something is wrong, right? Something is very, very wrong with the business world. And so it was through my experience in the corporate world that I learned to kind of to study the future of work and employee experience. Unfortunately, it had nothing to do with school, nothing to do with college. There was no future of work and employee experience 10 years ago when I was graduating from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Those topics and themes were not discussed at all.
That's right. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the past few years, as you mentioned, around employee engagement, or actually disengagement to be accurate, and employee experience. But they're not really the same. What's the difference between the two, in your opinion?
Employee experience and employee engagement, you're right. We oftentimes use those terms interchangeably. And for me, I think there's a very key, distinct differentiating factor. So let's start off with employee engagement. Now, it's not to say that employee engagement is bad, because it's not. It has been a very useful concept, an idea, and an approach that has really propelled many organizations around the world to hopefully become better. But unfortunately, and by the way, this wasn't what employee engagement was supposed to become. It's just what happened. Mm-hmm. Most companies around the world treat employee engagement as a way of introducing perks to drive some sort of increased satisfaction. And so what that means is that you don't change the core workplace practices about what it's like to work there. You don't look at any of that sort of stuff. You really focus on these short-term fixes. Yeah. So you might find that somebody starts working for your company, over time satisfaction drops off, and so you introduce a perk like free food on Tuesdays or work from home on Fridays. And so you do that, and over time your satisfaction goes up a little bit, then again it drops back down, and you introduce another perk, and that's kind of the cycle that you go through. Employee experience, on the other hand, has become this idea of changing the core workplace practices. So if I had to sum it up in a sentence, I would say employee engagement is about focusing on perks to distract employees from the realities of their work life. And employee experience is changing the core workplace practices around your people. And they don't have to be at odds with each other. I think that when you invest in the experiences of your people, you create an engaged workforce.
Right. It's an outcome or results of the experience.
Exactly. So it's sort of like the cause, the effect, and then you get business outcomes. Yeah. Our problem has always been that employee engagement is the effect of something, but we haven't really done a good job of trying to understand the cause. And so most companies around the world, they're stuck measuring employee engagement, and they're racking their heads trying to figure out, how do we improve this effect? How do we improve this effect? But really what they should be asking is, what is the cause of this effect, and how do we adjust that? So I look at it as employee experience comes first, That is what shapes and creates an engaged workforce, and then you get the business outcomes. And so we have just been focusing on the wrong side of the equation for a long time.
Yeah, and even in your book, you mentioned that talking to CHROs, some of them acknowledge that they even conduct surveys on specific occasions, knowing what the outcome is going to be, whether it's going to be a positive or a sort of negative response from the employees. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of companies that measure annual employee engagement do so because it's sort of an ingrained practice, right? So I just got off the phone before I was speaking with you with the deputy director of the National Institutes of Health. And this is sort of the government agency that's responsible for pretty much anything health related in the United States. And the Office of Personnel Management in the United States is kind of the government organization that dictates how other government entities should approach things like employee engagement. And he was telling me that they have a 150 question survey that they are supposed to send out every year to their people.
Wow, that's a lot of questions.
Exactly. 150 questions, right? That measures basically everything. And the language is vague and you don't really know what they mean when they say supervisor or manager, because it could be, different layers in the company. By the time you analyze the data and get back the information, like a long time goes by. But they still do it because they have to. And I think many organizations around the world who are doing this annual employee engagement survey know that it kind of doesn't make sense and that the data isn't as actionable and it takes too long, but they still do it because it's kind of a way that they are using to justify the existence of their HR departments, which is quite sad. But I think we're starting to sort of shift away from that and understand that there are probably better things that we can be doing.
Why is the employee experience becoming such an important topic today?
Well, I think it has to be because we are, this concept of the war for talent isn't new. It's been around for many, many years. But I think in a world where we're hearing about AI and automation and challenges attracting and retaining people, really the organizations who invest in employee experience are the ones who are, I believe, going to succeed and thrive when we think about the future of work, right? So it's not something that companies do because it's nice, because it's fun, because it's a good thing. It's because it genuinely drives business performance. And I actually analyzed 252 companies around the world, and I looked at revenue and profit and stock price performance and turnover and all of these different metrics. And the companies who do an amazing job at investing in employee experience crush everybody else. So it's a business imperative that allows your organization to outperform your competition. And that is a very, very important thing.
So let's say on this topic, because when you talk, just when you throw an idea to an executive, typically, and it requires some investment in either personnel or even financial investment, they're going to ask you, what's the expected business outcome or what's the ROI? So how do you measure, how do you quantify the return on investments on employee experience initiatives?
Well, the good thing for me is, two things, right? So the first is that my job is not to convince anybody of anything. My job is simply to show what I found, what research I've uncovered, to show what other companies are doing. And then organizations and leaders who represent them can decide if that is something that is worth their time pursuing. It's sort of like exercising, right? So I can tell you the benefits about working out and about eating healthy and going to the gym, and you need to decide if that's worth it for you. So ultimately what I do is the same thing. I tell companies how the workplace is changing. I help companies understand the drivers and the trends that are shaping the future of work. And I help them understand what some of the leading companies around the world are doing to prepare. And ultimately, it's up to the organization to decide if they want to do anything with that information or not. Now, I like to think that I've done a pretty good job of building a good case through the ROI analysis, through the stock price performance, through the profit, through the revenue, like all these things that I've looked at. I'd like to think that I've made a pretty compelling case of why companies should invest in employee experience. But of course, there are some leaders out there who say, I don't know. I don't get it. And to them, I just say, that's fine, right? I'm not, it doesn't matter to me. If you don't want to do it, don't do it, right? It's your company. It's your choice. It's your business. But don't be surprised if you do nothing and 5-10 years down the road, you start to notice that you have all of these challenges with your organization. So that's kind of the approach that I take, right? I mean, I sincerely hope that companies do make these investments and do take these initiatives seriously. But at the same time, I fully understand that there are some companies out there who will just say, nope, it doesn't make sense. I'm not going to do it. And, that's their choice.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. Now, there has been some. I mean, you have had a lot of companies on your show. One comes to my mind. It's Airbnb. They have a dedicated head of the employee experience, right? So, at a high level, what are the EX drivers in an organization?
Well, there are 3 environments that I look at. And so the way that I got to these environments is I interviewed around 150 senior level executives. These are people like the chief HR officer at Marriott, the chairman of the board at Yahoo, the chief technology officer at Xerox. So all sorts of different roles, senior level executives at companies around the world. And then I went through 150 case studies, articles, and research reports to try to figure out what do employees care about most at work. And I found that there are really 3 things or 3 environments that shape every employee experience: culture, technology, and physical space. Now, there are attributes to each one of these things, but by and large, it's about the tools that you have access to get your job done, the physical space in which you work, and how you feel working for the organization and how you feel doing the work that you are supposed to be doing. Those 3 things shape every employee experience for every employee at every company around the world.
I would say, I mean, first of all, I've read your book, and it's a very thorough, well-detailed research, and you have a lot of great examples of what successful companies have done in terms of implementing employee experiences. Can you go a bit deeper into, so you have some acronyms: cool spaces, ACE, technology, celebrated culture. What are some of the most important elements of those 3 areas, or those 3 environments, as you say?
Sure. So we can start off with ACE technology. So yeah, there are 3 little acronyms that I created for each one to try to make it easier to remember. ACE technology, one of the things that employees care about most when it comes to technology at work is having tools that are consumer grade. So these are tools that are so beautiful and useful and valuable that employees would consider using them in their personal lives if something similar existed. Another key criteria is making sure that the technology is focused on the needs of the employees, not just on the requirements of the business. When we look at cool spaces, one of the things that employees care about most is leveraging multiple workspace options. It's not just about open or closed. It's not just about a coffee shop or a home office. It's giving employees that multiple environment flexibility. So you might have an office that has some open spaces, some modern cubicles, some conference rooms, some quiet areas, some collaboration spaces and lounge areas. It's a diverse floor plan, not just one way of working or 2 ways of working. And when we look at a celebrated culture, that one was obviously the longest one. There were 10 attributes. One of the things that employees care about most there is having a manager who acts as a coach and a mentor at work. So somebody that truly understands the employee as an individual, not just as a worker. So having that coach, that mentor mentality is very, very crucial. And there are other things that make up celebrated culture, like overall positive brand perception, diversity and inclusion, and a couple other things there as well.
What should organizations really consider when they want to implement or design an employee experience strategy? What are the let's say main 3-4 main things to consider?
Well, the good news is that to design employee experiences, you already have the main ingredient, right? Which is employees.
Yes.
And so perhaps one of the biggest pieces of advice that I can give companies is ignore what other companies are doing, ignore the research reports and the studies that other companies are putting out, and make decisions based on the data that you collect about your people. Because what works for Google, what works for Facebook isn't going to work for you. If a company a research and an analyst firm says that 80% of millennials are job hoppers, or that 90% of Gen Xers hate technology, right? Just making things up. It doesn't mean that that's the same at your company. And I find that oftentimes we make business decisions based on external third-party data. When the reality is that we should be making business decisions based on the data that we have inside of our companies. So I'll give you an example. You may have heard of this trend, as I'm sure many of your listeners did, about getting rid of performance reviews, right? Getting rid of annual performance reviews and how terrible they are. And companies around the world have been writing articles about this and saying how they're moving to other things. Facebook wrote a fantastic article for Harvard Business Review. And they said, we're going to keep our annual performance review because our employees like it. And they collected data about their annual performance review. They surveyed their employees. They talked to their employees. They did focus groups. They had all of this data, which showed that the employees at Facebook actually prefer an annual performance review, but they would like it improved. Right? So they want to improve in certain areas, but they're okay with doing the annual performance review. Now, had Facebook not had that data, they would have just made this wide sweeping change across their company, and their employees would have hated it. And they would have invested time and money and resources into getting rid of something when their employees didn't want them to get rid of it to begin with.
Right.
So don't go with a trend just because other people are doing it. I think the best piece of advice that I can give is to leverage, you already have the focus group, right? You have your sample size, which is your people. You, as a leader, as somebody who represents your organization, it works at your organization, what you need to do best is to create that ongoing dialogue, right? They say the key to any successful relationship is, communication and trust, transparency. The same thing is true inside of your company. You need to build that relationship. You need to build that ongoing dialogue, that communication, that trust, that transparency between the employees who work there. And they will tell you everything that they care about and that they value. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to do everything that they say. It doesn't mean that all of their ideas are going to be right. But that's what brings us to the second key criteria, which is thinking of your organization more like a laboratory and less like a factory. It's this idea of testing ideas, of experimenting, of iterating, of playing around with stuff and seeing what works and what doesn't. Right? So that's another key criteria. And then the third one that I can say, and I can keep going, but I'll stop at 3, is you have to put people in positions of power who genuinely care about other people. It sounds like it should be very common sense, but there's a famous quote that says common sense is not all that common. And really what I think a lot of companies do is they promote people who are good at bringing in the most amount of money, right? Let's be honest. That's what happens, right? You close the biggest deals, and as a reward, you get promoted to become a VP, and now you're responsible for managing other people. that's not the right way to do that, right? Just because you bring in money doesn't mean you have any kind of attributes for leading and engaging and inspiring and motivating people. So we need to put people in positions of power who are genuinely good at those more traditional soft skills. Put people in positions of power who care about others. I think those are three great places for organizations to start. But we need to understand that this isn't a very clean process, right? It's kind of messy, right? It's sort of like, I'm not a chef. I don't know if any of your listeners are chefs, but it's sort of like trying to make a complicated dish for the first time, and you're not a chef, right? So it's going to get messy. You're going to get things all over the floor. You're probably going to mess up. You might have to do it a few times. You might even cut yourself with a knife, right? But the point is that you need to go through that to be able to kind of create something that you want to eat. And I think the same is true inside of our companies. So don't expect it to be like, we did it once and it came out perfectly, right? I tried to make a souffle once, and on my first attempt, it was the perfect souffle. Doesn't happen. So you have to expect that this is a little bit of a messy process. It's complicated. It's not that easy, but it's something that we all need to sort of go through.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. A very common theme across my guests on the podcast is the need for the CEO and the C-suite to be vulnerable and to accept the notion of failure in the sense that, as you said, it's a lab. It's just an experiment. It might not work. It may work. If it doesn't work, just let's learn from it and make some adjustments.
Yeah, I mean, that is, from a lot of the organizations that I've interviewed, that's a very common approach, right? So you're going to make mistakes, right? You might introduce a policy or a practice that employees don't like, or maybe they suggested it and it's just you're not able to implement it in an effective way. And that's okay, right? So this experimentation mentality, I think, is very, very important when we think about the future of work, when you think about employee experience. You just have to have that mentality.
Yeah, and I really like the analogy around software development process. Now you're going to develop a software. You're going to test it even on a small market sample. You're going to get feedback, make iteration, and then go back into development, make those changes, test it again, and so forth and so forth. And that should be the same around employee experience. You're going to take some initiatives to, implement a few things. If it doesn't work, just accept it and be able to move forward and make those adjustments.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, right? This is it's a never-ending thing. It's an ongoing change, and your workforce is going to change, and some people will leave, and new people will join, and it's a very dynamic and fluid thing, and we need to be okay with that, right? It's sort of like being comfortable in the chaos. You can't plan for everything. You can't structure everything. You might want everybody to stay at your company and everybody to be happy forever. And that's just not the way that it's going to work. So you need to be okay with a little bit of chaos, and you need to be okay with that little bit of uncertainty, because that's just the nature of the world, right? I mean, the only job security I believe that exists is the one that you create for yourself. So as an employee, if you are willing to put your faith and you are willing to put your career in the hands of somebody else, then you need to be prepared and understand that there is going to be that level of uncertainty, and there is going to be that level of chaos, and that nothing is forever in that corporate world. So unless you're willing to build something yourself, you need to be okay with that. But I don't think it's reasonable today, in today's world, for any employee to assume that they will go work for a company, and that if they do a good job, they will have a job for life, right? Even if they want to. That's just not how it works.
Right, it doesn't work anymore like this.
No, I mean, when the first thing that happens to an organization when they have problems is they cut people. And whether you are a great employee or not, if you're a part of a team or a function or a division or a region that is maybe not where the company thinks it should be, it will get cut, right? We see this all the time. There are organizations where, and I won't mention them, but they eliminate a sales division because the company is moving away from selling that particular product or service. You might be a great salesperson in that division, but if that division is getting cut, so are you. And we just have to accept, unfortunately, that is the reality of the world that we live in. And you can't just put blind faith into any company that you work for. It's one of the reasons why I'm a big believer in perpetual learning. Right? You are responsible, right? Everybody listening to this, you are responsible for your career and you are responsible for your personal and your professional development, not anybody else. Don't blame your company. Don't blame your school. Don't blame your manager, right? If you want to be successful, you have to take that accountability in your own hands.
I completely agree with you. You mentioned a bit earlier the role of employee data. What is fascinating to me is many companies do very well at collecting and leveraging customer data in order to design customer experience strategies. Why is it so hard to do this on the employee side?
Something that we see time and time again, right? Everybody always talks about customer data and customer analytics. And I think that the big problem is that organizations have been very obsessed with external things, right? Customers. We're very obsessed with everything that's going on in the external world. And today we're at a world, or we're living in a time where organizations are being forced to look internally. And you would think that you would look internally before you look externally, but ever since the creation of modern business, we've done the exact opposite. We spent all of our time and efforts and energy on the external side, and we've never looked internally, right? It's sort of like somebody that is always trying to make other people happy, that they don't spend enough time trying to understand what makes them happy, right? I mean, we all know those people that they're always trying to make other people happy. They're people pleasers, but they don't really know themselves, right? They don't have that level of self-awareness. So I equate that to the organization's self-awareness. Most companies in the world do not have that self-awareness of truly knowing who they are and their people and having the data and the understanding of all those different things. And so now I think companies want that. And you cannot have that without data. And specifically looking at the data aspect, it's tough because we have a lot of employee data. We have data that's not standardized. We have data that's oftentimes not accurate. We have data that lives in different technology platforms that we need to try to bring together. It's changing all of the time. And so part of it is a technology problem of bringing these things together. Part of it is I think a leadership problem of trying to understand what to do and how to do it. And I think there's a logistical problem of like, how do you actually do this, right? I mean, I know companies like Microsoft do a very good job of this, but it took them, I believe, 2 or 3 years to go through their employee data and to standardize it and to aggregate it and to make sure it's accurate and to get a process in place. Like, it takes time. And it takes a lot of commitment to do it.
Right.
It's not easy. So these are very real obstacles that are required, or they're very real obstacles that exist. But they require, I think, a special kind of person who is willing to tackle them, right? You need to have somebody at your company who's willing to speak up and to go after that challenge and say that I'm going to take this on. I'm going to try to do this. And we need more of those types of people.
There are a few topics that you're passionate about, obviously, on your podcast. What is your take on the gig economy? Do you think that at some point everybody's going to be a 1099 worker and we won't have any organizations anymore?
No, No, definitely not. At least not in the foreseeable future. So this is a very common topic that I get asked about quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And when most people think of the gig economy, there are kind of a few different layers here, right? So the gig economy, as most people think about it, they think of online platforms, right? Upwork, Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit. That's what most people think of when they think of the gig economy. Now, in the United States, and I talked about in this my book as well. I had some numbers from the UK, from Europe, and I think the numbers were also similar. But in the United States, the percentage of the workforce that is a part of that economy, and this is one research report, right? There are several different reports that are out there, was around 0.5%. Right. This was based on data that a bunch of economists did that worked for the government. They used financial data from J.P. Morgan Chase, where they looked at various bank accounts. And they found that there's a very small percentage of the workforce that is a part of this gig economy, meaning these online platforms. Now, it's growing quickly, but you'll notice that 0.5% is very different than some of these other reports that you hear where they say it's 53%. Uh-huh. Right? There are some studies out there that say 53% of Americans are doing freelance work. Now, the way that those reports phrase it is true, but if you look at how they talk about freelance work, basically, if you do anything freelance-wise just once, if you do it once in a year, you're considered a freelancer.
Yeah, so selling anything on eBay is being a freelancer. Is it what you mean?
In a lot of these reports, yes. Or if you have tried to be an Uber driver and you did it for one day and then you stopped, you are a freelancer. And so the numbers, I think, are very, very inflated, right? Because you don't need to be a rocket scientist to look around and say that there's no way that half of the American workforce is doing freelance work, right? Like that's astronomical. The second thing is that a large percentage of these people are not doing it full time.
Right.
These people have full-time jobs. As a way to make extra money, they will do something like this on the side. So I think that the gig economy is growing. It's very important. It's a very crucial trend to pay attention to. I think it means we will have a much more dynamic and distributed workforce. But I don't think that it means full-time jobs are going to go away. Full-time jobs will absolutely, at least in the near foreseeable future, become the number one way, and still are the number one way, for how we work. Now, there's a broader umbrella area underneath, or I should say above the gig economy, which is contingent labor. Now, contingent labor includes people who are 1099 workers, who are consultants. These are people who might work through a staffing agency like Manpower or Kelly Services. In the United States, the majority of jobs that have been created over the past 10 years have been in contingent labor. Right? So this isn't people that are using online platforms. These are more traditional, established consulting 1099 types of roles. So that's an interesting thing, right? That's an interesting thing to pay attention to. So that's kind of a long-winded way to answer your question of, I don't think full-time jobs are going to go away. I think we will still have the majority of full-time jobs, but I think we will also have a much more dynamic workforce where your employees are going to be comprised of various different types of categories, and we need to be prepared for that.
Right, and you mentioned earlier that employees have to invest in their own development, right? And the gig economy gigs are one way to invest in your own development. You do a few things on the side, like I'm doing right now with the podcast and the conferences. It's a way for me to learn and to discuss and learn from companies what they do and what they don't do on the in the employee experience space. So do you see the gig economy as a way for employees to increase their knowledge and learn a few things?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, technically, I'm considered a gig worker or a freelance worker. Right. Anybody that's an author is typically in that category because they work for multiple people. But it's tough, right? Because it depends on the company, right? Some companies will say that you're not allowed to work for anybody else while you're working here, and other companies are more lenient with their policies. But I think that, yeah, I mean, being a freelancer or even having a full-time job and doing some gig work on the side is a great way to learn new things, to figure out what you really like doing and what you don't like doing. And it builds your skill sets, right? Because being a freelancer, a successful freelancer, means that you need to learn about all sorts of things that are outside of your traditional skill set. So, speaking from personal experience, as somebody that speaks at a lot of conferences and advises companies, I had to learn about building proposals. I had to learn about putting together a website. I had to learn about paying quarterly taxes and about dealing with all of these things that I had no idea about 10 years ago. So you need to build a skill set because being a freelancer, a successful freelancer, is essentially building a business, right? It's being an entrepreneur.
Sure.
And so being an entrepreneur means not just being good at something, but knowing how to build a business. So you could be an amazing designer, an amazing developer, but if you want to build your business, you also need to learn how to sell. You need to learn about contracts and proposals and legal. Like, you got to learn about all sorts of things. So I definitely believe that being a freelancer is great because you will learn all sorts of different things that you can also bring back to the business world. As a freelancer, you have to learn to be scrappy. You don't have a lot of resources oftentimes to do certain things. And so you can take that mentality inside of your organization to think a little bit more like an entrepreneur when you're trying to solve problems. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a great thing. We can all benefit from learning to think more like entrepreneurs.
We talked earlier about technology being one of the 3 EX environments. There are conflicting perspectives on how technology is going to either disrupt the workforce, it's going to change in the positive way the workforce. What's your take on this?
So on which aspect changing the workforce?
On the technology changing the way we work.
Technology, yes. Well, technology is a big, broad topic, right? So I suppose it depends on which technology you're referring to. We have everything from AI and automation to the Internet of Things and big data and wearables and technology.
Let's focus on automation.
Sure. So is whether or not automation is a good or a bad thing for the workforce? Is essentially your question. Yes. Well, it's tough, right? Because I'll tell you the experiences that I have. And it's a little frustrating because on the one hand, you hear that there are all these reports and studies that come out that say, 50% of jobs are going to be automated and we're going to have massive unemployment. And you hear all this from various economists and from research reports. But at the same time, I speak with a lot of these global executives who are running these companies, and they tell me different things. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that we keep hearing about are retail establishments and restaurants introducing kiosks and robots, where when you show up to order, you don't need a human anymore. You just go to a kiosk and order all of your food. And basically everybody's saying that, well, if you work for a restaurant chain, you're basically out of a job because specifically, more of a fast food restaurant chain, that you're out of a job because everybody is going to just use a kiosk and you no longer need cashiers. You don't need any of that stuff anymore. Now, I spoke with the chief people officer at McDonald's recently, and he was a guest on the podcast as well. And McDonald's represents one of the world's largest employers around the world. And I asked him this question, and he told me that they're not seeing that. So for all of their restaurants where they have these kiosks, they have either increased the number of human workers or they have left them the same, but they did not reduce the number of human workers. And the reason for that is because they are just shifting what the humans do. The humans now focus more on service. They will now bring you your food. They will take you to your table. They will ask you how you're doing. They will come check on you. And so they are not getting rid of humans. They are simply changing the work that humans do. And I see this all the time. Accenture is another example that I always use, where Accenture recently, they automated 10,000 jobs. These were people in finance who were basically crunching numbers. And Accenture introduced technology that could now do this. And so they automated 10,000 jobs. So what did they do with 10,000 people? Instead, they retrained these 10,000 people, and they allowed them to focus more on the strategic aspects of finance. So not just crunching numbers, but helping their customers and their clients understand what these numbers mean, giving them advice, and shifting them to a more strategic role. So it's very hard because on the one hand, I see these reports that say 50% of jobs are going to be replaced. And on the other hand, I see some of the world's largest employers who are introducing automation and technology, but they're not reducing their headcount. So that's kind of the position that I'm in. Now, for me, what I have seen for organizations around the world, and bear with me while I explain this, is that it doesn't matter. Because when you talk to any company around the world, whether you tell them that their workforce will be automated or not, their course of action is the same. In other words, every company in the world today invests in training, they invest in education, they invest in building partnerships with universities. They already do these things. And so when you go to these companies and you say, hey, guess what? You're going to have a massive automated workforce. What are you going to do about it? They always say the same thing. Well, we're going to invest in education, we're going to invest in training, and we're going to build alliances with universities. But they're already doing that, right? So in other words, regardless of the path that you take, whether you assume new jobs will be created or whether you assume a lot of jobs will be eliminated, the path that companies take and their action items are identical, right? They don't, and this is part of the scary thing, right? They don't do anything different. And that's, I think, a challenge for companies around the world. In fact, the only new, unique concept that has been proposed when it comes to automation is universal basic income, right? Paying people a flat monthly wage regardless of what they're doing. Like, that's been really the only new concept that we've created. But if you think about it, what other new things are there? Right? When you talk about automation and everybody says, oh my God, even if you say like 60%, 50% of the workforce is going to be automated, what should we do? There are no new solutions. Everybody says the same thing. Well, you got to do education, you got to do training, you got to take classes online. We're already doing that, right? So there's nothing new that has been proposed. So that's kind of one angle of it. Now, the other side is, what do I think is going to happen? I think we need to prepare for both. Right. I think that it's very hard to say. I interviewed Nolan Bushnell on a podcast, and he created Atari and Chuck E. Cheese, and he's basically the founder of the video game and the entertainment technology space. And he had a very interesting approach. He said, basically, the only people who believe that automation will take away jobs are people that don't have imagination and creativity. And he said that as long as we have imagination and creativity, we will create new jobs, we will build new jobs, and we will figure out things that we should be doing. And so I like to be an optimist, and I would like to think that that will be the case, but it's very hard to say, right? I think we're split. You see some famous leaders and technologists like Mark Zuckerberg say that he's an optimist and everything will be okay. And then you have people like Elon Musk say, oh, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, we're all screwed. So who do you listen to?
Yeah, I'm like you on the optimist side.
Yeah. So, and it's probably a little bit more of a philosophical choice as well, right? Do you want to take the negative dystopian view or the more positive view? I prefer to take a little bit more of the positive view, but I think you need to prepare also for the negative view. And so my advice to people is to, again, not be surprised by what the future might bring. So as an individual, you need to understand that when it comes to automation, like, you're the only one that is going to future-proof your career, not your company. So you need to be aware that the smoke is on the horizon, and that the automation discussions are coming, and a lot of industries have the potential to be disrupted. And what can you do? So we saw this with finance, right? So look at a bunch of financial professionals around the world who have all been replaced by algorithms and software. Wall Street in New York City is all but a deserted floor, right? I mean, there are barely any people that work there anymore. And so what happened to these finance professionals? Well, you don't hear too many stories about all these finance professionals that can't find jobs and they're out of work, because a lot of them have shifted careers, right? A lot of them work in HR, they do people analytics, and a lot of them have taken their skills into other industries, into other areas. So my advice to you, for people that are listening, is be aware of what your skills are and how they can be applied to other industries outside of your own, because I think that is something that you're going to have to really think about.
So on a more positive note, it sounds like it's a dark picture ahead. So on a more positive note, how do you see technology affecting the employee experience? I know that on some of your podcasts, some of the guests talked about AI and chatbots being able to provide a more personalized experience to the employees. How do you see this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge factor, right? So AI will absolutely be able to provide more personalized experiences because it will know more about who you are and what you like and what you value. AI will also be used as a kind of assistant to the organization. Mm-hmm. So there are already companies around the world who are using something like Alexa, right, the Amazon Echo, as a way to give voice commands to ask it questions around, how many people do I have working here? Who are the best teams inside of my company? Or I want to build a new team in Los Angeles. Which 5 people do you recommend that I use? Right. So imagine being able to ask via voice command these types of questions to a piece of software that can then give you that information. Right. What was my profit? What was my revenue? Which teams are not doing well? So we'll absolutely see, I think, AI as a way to help us make better informed business decisions and to drive performance. I think we will definitely see AI as a way to create more personalized and contextualized experience inside of our company. But I also think there are some dangers. I don't think that we should rely completely on AI for everything, because at the end of the day, we still don't know how AI makes the decisions that it makes. To the average person, if a piece of software tells you something and you ask it a question like, which 5 people should I put on this new team? And it'll say, Alex, Jessica, it'll give you 5 names. You don't know why those 5 people have been selected, right? You don't understand, and we don't have like the inner workings of why these 5 people were grouped together. So we still need to have a little bit of that human understanding, that human component to help us understand the big picture. There's a great story. There's a book called Weapons of Math Destruction. And in the book, the author talks about the algorithm that was created to try to figure out who are the lowest performing teachers in a school district. And so they create this algorithm, and it gives them a list of 200 teachers. And they fire all 200 teachers. And one of the teachers, her name was Susan, she was consistently getting good reviews. The teachers loved her. The principal loved her. Everybody loved her. And she couldn't figure out why she got fired. And it turns out that the students that Susan was teaching, they came from a different school where there was a lot of cheating. And not cheating on behalf of the students, but cheating on behalf of the teachers. In other words, during standardized tests, the teachers would erase the incorrect answers of the students, and they would fill in the correct answers. And the teachers at that school did it because they wanted to make themselves look better, like they were great teachers. And so the students then went from that school, they transferred to this new school where Susan was teaching them. And again, they took these same standardized tests, but now there was no cheating. And all of their scores went down. And so the algorithm flagged this and said, oh, well, Susan must be a bad teacher because their scores used to be high. Now they're very low. So Susan, I'm sorry, we got to let you go. Mm-hmm. Right? So an algorithm in that situation tells you to fire Susan. A human might look at that and say, all right, wait a minute. Right? What's the bigger picture here? Let's take a look at what's going on. And maybe a human would have come to a different conclusion. So I think that AI is good at helping us make decisions, but we shouldn't leverage AI yet to fully make the decisions for us. So hopefully that answers your question. Yeah,
definitely. That's a good way to put it. Now we're getting close to the end, but I want to wrap up our conversation. And I'm curious, can you share with us maybe one example from your book of a company that has successfully implementing the employee experience?
So there are many companies that are making tremendous efforts and investments in employee experience, right? And remember, again, employee experience, it's a never-ending thing. It's something that is very much ongoing. But there are a few companies that I think are doing a good job. Cisco is definitely one of them. And Cisco has made tremendous investments in not just their corporate culture programs, but in redesigning their physical spaces and giving employees great technologies to get their jobs done. They hold hackathons where their teams come together and actually break HR and try to rebuild it. They create modern spaces that leverage technologies to enable employees to work. They have very flexible environments. And they're constantly trying to think of new programs and initiatives that they can introduce. Adobe is another good example that's doing something similar. Donna Morris is their head of customer and employee experience. So she runs both of those teams and functions.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And so, it's hard to say, because people ask me that all the time, like, which companies are doing a good job here? And it's not that they're doing anything that's super radical or unique, right? I can't say, is Cisco doing something so unique that no other company is doing? No, all right. I mean, there are plenty of other companies out there that have thought about redesigning their space, and plenty of companies that have introduced technology and, leadership training programs. I think what Cisco does a very good job of is understanding their people and listening to their people and building programs out and involving their people in the process. And that's really something that separates great companies from just good companies. You don't design things for people, you design things with your people. And when you have that approach and that mentality, I think that's when truly great experiences happen. And Cisco does a very good job of that.
Good. Thank you so much. Now, before we conclude, I'd like to ask at this point in the interview a few personal questions so that our listeners get to know our guest a bit more intimately. If you were to invite a historical figure for dinner, who would that be and why?
Well, there are a couple, actually. So I really like chess. So I would love to invite, Gary Kasparov is still alive, but I'd love to have dinner with him, or Magnus Carlsen, who's currently the #1 chess champion. If I had to look at people that are no longer with us, I think it would be fun to invite the person who created chess. I think it was a mathematician by the name of Sissa who created it over 1,000 years ago. Or Bobby Fischer. Some of those guys would be a lot of fun to have at dinner.
Interesting. What's the essential item you always take with you on vacation?
Oh, there are many things.
Hopefully you don't say your phone.
No. Well, I guess it's on my phone, but it's a chess. It's a chess app. So again, I'm pretty obsessed with chess.
I can see that.
So it doesn't have to be on my phone. It could be on my computer, but it's almost like a form of meditation for me. But so that, if not that, headphones, because I always listen to music when I'm working out and when I'm traveling, flying. So either my chess app or my headphones, I think, are my most used travel accessories, and my camera, because I do a lot of videos and take pictures.
Good. So besides playing chess, what excites you the most when you go to work?
Well, technically, I'm always working, right? Because I have a home office that I share with my wife and my 2 dogs and a little baby. So what excites me most at work? Honestly, I wake up every day very excited to start working because I never know what's going to happen. I always get very interesting requests from companies to speak or from companies that want to work with me in some capacity. I love the feedback and the comments that I get from people that read my book or see anything that I put up on LinkedIn. So I love the interaction and the community and the interest that people have around the future of work and employee experience. So that's what excites me the most is that engagement and that dialogue.
And finally, what's your favorite food?
Oh man, favorite food. I love so many different types of food that it's very hard to say. Pizza's great, chocolate, sushi, anything tasty, pretty much, I'll eat it.
Okay. Well, so I will remind everybody of your latest book, The Employee Experience Advantage. Where can we find your book? I assume Amazon and other places like this?
Yep, it's available wherever books are sold. Amazon tends to be the most popular place for people to buy it. And so, if you do buy it, let me know so I can send you a thank you. And if you do buy it and send it to me, I'm happy to sign it and send it back to you or send you a signed sticker that you can then use in the book. So I appreciate anybody that buys it.
Okay, could you send me a sticker? I'll add it to my book.
Sure, of course.
Awesome. Now, how can we follow you on social media? Whether it's your podcast, it's what you do, where can we find the next conference you're speaking at?
Thankfully, that's very easy to do. So if you just Google my name, Jacob Morgan, it'll take you to my website. And on my website, you can find everything. I have a new class that I just created on Skillshare. My Twitter is on there, my Facebook. My email is jacob@thefutureorganization.com for people that have any questions they want to send me. But I'm pretty easy to find, so I hope people will be able to connect with me.
Yeah, Google is pretty easy. And YouTube as well, right?
Yep, I have a weekly show on YouTube. I have my podcast called The Future of Work Podcast. But if you go to my website, The Future Organization, you'll see all of that stuff linked on there.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It was an honor to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at expodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.